So welcome everyone. We're now back into part 2 of our life cycle of an early stage tax dispute. Part 1 covered informal inquiries, and we're now going to look at what happens when an inquiry is opened formally by HMRC. So if you look at our example that Sophie went through in the last session, you've got our timeline, and where we are is the second little bullet along. So a formal inquiry has been opened by HMRC. So that's where we are. So what happens if HMRC don't feel they've received satisfactory answers from a taxpayer in respect of their informal inquiries? The next step is probably to open a formal inquiry into the tax return. And that could be for a number of reasons. So either HMRC think that there are documents or information they're not being given, or it's taking too long to get information using the informal approach, or more likely is that the time period for opening a formal inquiry into the return is going to expire. So what they do is open the inquiry on a formal basis to protect their position regarding whatever tax it is that they're inquiring into. So what happens? Well, HMRC can open a tax inquiry into a company, an individual, or a partnership self-assessment tax return, or into an amendment to a return. And the way they do this is by giving written notice of its intention to do so. They can choose to contact a taxpayer informally, which Sophie already outlined in the previous session. But the fact that they've asked those questions informally doesn't prejudice them from opening the formal inquiry into a tax return. Now, HMRC will be looking to accomplish a number of things from the initial formal inquiry into the return. First, they'll be looking to examine the company's returns and other documents and information to establish the facts before making a case that the taxpayer has in fact made a technical error. Secondly, in order to establish the fact pattern and assist them in obtaining evidence that the taxpayer has made an error in its calculation and assessment of tax, it will ask for documents and information to verify the position. And thirdly, in theory at least, HMRC will be looking where possible to cover the risks in their initial request to avoid asking for piecemeal information from the company. HMRC guidance makes clear that this should include penalty risks. So once the facts have been established, there's still likely to be scope for discussion of technical issues, and further correspondence is likely to be required. What this means in practice is that HMRC can still request further documents, and further correspondence may be entered into with the company, depending on the nature of responses provided to the initial inquiry requests. So what can they ask for? Well, in their initial letter, they can ask for any records that are reasonably required for the purposes of checking the accuracy of the return, and which HMRC would later be able to request in the Schedule 36 information notice. And for more on that, see the next session. However, they're not supposed to make preemptory demands for information or documents, and they shouldn't reference statutory powers unless it's necessary to do so. HMRC should also explain why they're raising the assessment. Their guidance states that both the taxpayer and the agent should know what's required of them. It's worth noting in this context that there's an HMRC charter, and that was last updated in November 2020, and that sets out what to expect from HMRC and what HMRC expect from taxpayers. That includes taxpayers' general rights and obligations, and it might be helpful to check the level of service that HMRC are expected to provide if you feel that the officer you're encountering is being particularly difficult. It's worth referencing that charter if you do end up with an HMRC inquiry. So that's HMRC's position, and that's set out on the left-hand side. Now, on the right-hand side of the slide, I've set out a few things that the company should be thinking about and the company's position. And the first question you should always be asking if a company receives a notice of inquiry is whether that inquiry is valid. Now, there's a few points that you should check here. So has the notice been sent to the company or the relevant taxpayer directly? It's fine for that notice to be copied to the company's agent for information, but the form that taxpayers use to authorise HMRC to deal with an agent doesn't provide that authority. So if a notice of inquiry is sent to an agent but not to the taxpayer, no valid inquiry has been opened. Another point to check is there already an open inquiry into your return? You can only have one inquiry into each return or into each amendment to a return. Another point to check is whether the inquiry has been made within the time limits for opening an inquiry. This is known as the inquiry window. the date of that depends whether you're in a group or if you're classified as small. So if the company wasn't in a group or is classified as small, the inquiry window would typically be 12 months after the tax return was delivered. And the taxpayer needs to receive the notice to inquire before the last day on which the inquiry can begin. It's not enough for the notice to have just been issued before that date. That's made clear in HMRC's guidance. Then you should ask, does the inquiry relate to information that's contained in the return? HMRC do have to use the correct procedure to go through with an inquiry. And there's case law that says that a tax return has a specific and narrow meaning, and that does not simply refer to everything contained in the return. So for these purposes, the tax return means the information in a return is submitted for the purposes of establishing a person's tax charge for the year to which the return relates. There are a few other points to note here. So the inquiry can be about anything in the return or anything that should have been in the return, and that includes claims and elections. The notice doesn't have to state the reason for the inquiry, and the opening of the inquiry is a precondition for HMRC to issue a follower notice or an accelerated payment notice. So the inquiry can mean that there are further steps that HMRC are intending to take later in inquiring into a tax return. An inquiry will finish when HMRC issues a closure notice. That can either be partial, and it can indicate that HMRC has concluded the inquiry in relation to discrete matters, but it's still investigating other aspects, or it can be a final closure notice, and that's where HMRC has concluded the inquiry into all matters. If the inquiry has continued for a long time, a taxpayer can apply to the first tier tribunal for a direction that HMRC should issue a final or a partial closure notice. And the tribunal should give this direction unless it's satisfied that there are reasonable grounds for not doing so. And that takes into account the complexity of the inquiry, the length of the inquiry, the degree to which the taxpayer has cooperated, and the amount of tax at stake. Now, these safeguards are intended to protect taxpayers against inquiries being unduly delayed. That means just HMRC holding the inquiry open for an extended period of time. HMRC are allowed to ask questions before opening inquiry into the return. See the previous session for more information on that. And as part of the inquiry, HMRC can also make a number of document requests or requests for further information. And those can be classed as informal requests, even if they're made as part of a formal inquiry. Now, for more on informal document requests, you'll want to listen to the next section, which is on HMRC's informal document requests, and we'll also be covering the Schedule 36 information notice. Thank you.